Thank you guys for being here. I'm so happy to be here at the Kleiner James Arts Center. It's so nice to have our panels in this venue, which is nice and intimate, so you can really experience the conversation with the panelists up close and get to ask them questions and really learn and get to know them. Before I'm going to introduce the panelists, I just want to talk a little bit about the festival, which is now in its 18th year. And we couldn't be here without our supporters, so I want to thank Marketech, who's been with us since year one, and 120 dB Films, and BMI, who's been with us since year one as well, and WGST, and Kettle One Vodka, and Grey Cross Law Firm, and Gigantic Pictures, and all of those who support us, from individuals to companies. As a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, this is how we get sustained. So thank them, and thank you so much for attending and supporting the festival, and those who participate in it, the filmmakers and the panelists. I hope that from here you'll also go and see some more movies and come to some more panels. There's so many great things, and I would love to see you at all of them. Here in Woodstock, in Rosendale, in Saugerties, and Rhinebeck, and tonight we have an award ceremony in Kingston. You know, the panels are among my most favorite parts of the festival, because that is where we get to really listen and hear from some of the top people in their respective fields in a, like I said, a very intimate setting. And for this panel, we have assembled really some of the most prolific filmmakers in the documentary film world. Each and every one of them have made a number of impact films that touch different issues that affect our world and our country. And to put it all together for you, I have asked Nancy Abraham, who is the Senior Vice President of HBO Documentaries, who knows each and every panelist here, and some of them actually have films on HBO Docs, to lead the conversation for you. So I would like now to bring moderator Nancy Abraham, and as well, and panelist Richard Rowley, Sam Pollard, Bob Herbert, and James Bedford. Thank you all very, very much for being here, and really look forward to hearing what you all have to say. Thank you.
Call me James.
All right, thanks, Mira. And thanks for coming, everyone. We have an amazing panel here today. So many esteemed documentary filmmakers who also have done other incredible things. But we'll just get right into the conversation, because I'm sure there's a lot to be said. You know, I was looking over the description for this panel, and one of the things it talks about is, do the arts have a responsibility to talk about the American condition and politics and everything else? And we can discuss whether they have a responsibility to do that or not, but I think it's very clear that they have a role. It may not be a responsibility, but there is a role of the arts in talking, particularly when you're talking about documentary film, in talking about the issues of the day. So I just wanted to kick it off, and I want to say, you know, panels I think work best when it's more of a conversation, so feel free to interject, interrupt, talk whenever you want.
Well, I'm going to start.
Okay, you start.
Back in 1980, I had an opportunity to work with a filmmaker named St. Clair Bourne. Up to that point, I had been an apprentice editor and assistant. I started editing at 25 or something. And my big concern at that time was to just make entertaining films, to work on entertaining documentaries and not deal with any kind of issues. I didn't want to do those things. But when I was working with St. Clair on this film called Chicago Blues, we would spend a lot of time together outside the editing room, talking about life, talking about being African American. And after that 8-month experience with Saint, he basically I made a left turn because he made me understand that as an African-American man, that I had a responsibility as both an editor and as a documentary filmmaker, which I wanted to do, to be a director, was to make sure that I told stories, or I was involved in stories, or engaged in stories that dealt with the African-American experience from a political perspective, from a social perspective, from an economic perspective.
That it was a responsibility.
That it was a responsibility. And it's something that, from that point on my career, I was 30 years old at the time, I took that on and understood that that's what I needed to do. So from every time I was involved in a project, it was hopefully a project that dealt with that. And Eyes on the Prize, When the Levees Broke, If God Is Willing, Four Little Girls. You know, so for me, it's a responsibility as a documentary filmmaker that you're involved in films that hopefully can have people look at the world politically and socially and economically racially from a different perspective.
Right. And you've also done fiction narrative films.
Yeah, I did fiction films with Spike, but Spike also was very, very political.
Yeah.
In all the films I did with Spike, there was always some political agenda in those films.
Yeah.
You know, Bamboozled, Clockers, he always dealt with political things. So to me, it's a responsibility that as a documentary filmmaker, I believe is very important to have.
Yeah.
Very important.
So let's talk about if anyone can speak to that if they want, and also to this issue of what makes the documentary film form sort of unique, its pros and cons in terms of getting different messages out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that the unique potential, the thing that film and television have over every other medium, is that is their ability to allow people to create vicarious identifications with people who they're separated from, potentially by massive political or geographic distance. I mean, at like the sort of cheapest, most commercial kind of level, you go to see an escapist, like, a James Bond film, and you feel this rush of identification with this guy who's, whatever, gets the girl and gets the bad guy or whatever. But the radical potential at the center of that medium is the ability to make an audience feel and identify with someone who they're not. And so it becomes a kind of a border-crossing medium, like a film that can create new sorts of, help crystallize new kinds of political identifications. And that is, something that it does better, I think, than print or any other kind of medium.
Yeah, I for me, my journey through documentaries, I started out screenwriting, and in around, my late 20s, I had a life-altering experience. I got desperately ill, was going to die. I got a liver transplant. I made it. And when I came out of that experience, I looked around and realized that there was this cultural, there was this mythology around what organ donation is, and a lot of it was pretty damaging, and I could see that it was creating a resistance to, embracing it. And so, I came into documentaries like, wow, people have to know what's really going on here. And so I focused on that to produce that, and that's how I met Nancy 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And, it was a one-off for me at the time, but, I went to think I'm just got to get this thing done, and I'm going to go back to screenwriting and directing and feature. But the process was so rewarding because I got to enjoy all the benefits of filmmaking and storytelling that I so enjoyed in terms of the process. But I also had that feeling that I was being additive and helpful in a way that, some of the other things I'd written or done didn't give me that same feeling. Mm-hmm. And so I have always focused on, for me, just personally, I'm really drawn to bringing to light things that I feel, the public should intuitively understand. That's, gaps of our knowledge, stubborn mythologies, misinformation. So, whether I'm doing health or environmental docs, that's my sweet spot.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with Jamie. I had a similar feeling that this is my first documentary, and the idea was you just want to present to the public something that you think people should know, or that people should understand better, or that people should understand in a deeper or more meaningful way. So I came from a lifetime, almost a lifetime in print journalism as a columnist and a few years as a correspondent for NBC News. So that was the extent of my experience with visual journalism. But my film was against all odds, the fight for a black middle class, and what I wanted to say in the film. I wanted to show how we got to this place where African Americans are seemingly struggling on every front so long after the civil rights movement, a half century after the civil rights movement. And I also wanted to show that the racism and discrimination and oppression and sometimes murderous oppression of African Americans in this country was, in my view, much worse than most people realized, and even worse than most African Americans realized. And I just think that in the present day, documentaries just, to me, seem to have more power than print journalism. If it's done right, and I'm here on a panel with master documentary filmmakers, so if it's done right, the message gets across in a much more powerful way, and therefore, hopefully, is understood better or has more of an impact on the viewer. So that's been my experience with documentaries, and whether I'll make another one or not remains to be seen.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said, if it's done right, and I think making documentaries is really hard. It's not easy. And sometimes it may seem easy, but it's rarely, if never, easy. So I would be curious to know, in your journeys of making these films, or any of the films that you've worked on, how have you approached, okay, here's what I want to communicate. How am I going to go about doing it? And there's all these different subgenres of documentaries, but if you can talk to that, and even specific examples when maybe something surprised you, or like you weren't expecting it to go in a certain way, and then something worked.
I'll give you two examples. When Spike approached Sheila at HBO and wanted to do When the Levees Broke, the big question was, Spike wanted to do this epic film, but always the question is, how do you do it? I mean, this is a big epic event, Hurricane Katrina. How are we going to tell the story? And Spike, being a storyteller, decided that one of the best things was for me and Judy Ailey, who was our researcher. We went down to New Orleans. And one of the things I think that's important when you're making documentaries about a big issue, you got to find people to help tell that story, to generate that story, to bring that story across. So we went down to New Orleans, and we spent 4 days down there locating people, finding people to talk to, interviewing.
Walking the streets? Or no.
Judy had done research, and she had found different stories and names. So we located some of these people that she had found. We went down and we sat down, had lunch with these people, pre-interviewed them. And after that lunch, we would say to ourselves, this person would be good for Spike to interview, or this person wouldn't be good for Spike. So then Spike was able to sort of capture the Katrina experience from different levels, from people in the community, from people in law enforcement, from people from FEMA, So he made it a story, because I always say the thing that, as a documentary filmmaker, I'm a strong believer that I'm also a storyteller. So you want to tell stories. So we knew that Spike wanted to tell this film through the voices of the people. And we went down there after we came back and gave Spike all this information. About a month later, we went down to New Orleans with a camera crew and lighting crew, and we interviewed over 100 people.
So then it becomes, the storytelling also becomes an editor's job.
It becomes an editor's job.
Because then you just have a lot of interviews,
which we
right?
have to shape.
Yeah.
Which we have to shape. But Spike knew that, and Spike knew that it was going to be through the people, and we weren't going to use narration, because with a lot of these documentaries, do you use narration? Do you use cards? How do you tell the story? We wanted to tell the story through the people. So that was sort of the perspective that we had. Now, the other examples, last year at the festival here, they showed my film, 2 Trains Running. Now, that film was about the search for 2 iconic blues musicians, Son House and Skip James, who had been popular in the 30s. But it was going to be a parallel story that told the journey and the search for Skip and Son House at the same time as Freedom Summer was happening in 1964, when young white kids went down to fight for voting rights in Mississippi. Now, the challenge as a documentary filmmaker was we had phenomenal archival footage to tell the story from the perspective of Freedom Summer. But we didn't have any footage of these young white kids looking for Son House and Skip James.
Right.
So as filmmakers, as you said, you need something visual, right? So we had to think about creatively, how do we visualize their journey? Now, as everyone knows here, we could have done reenactments with actors. You know, we went down to Mississippi and had the actors retrace that journey. But then we decided, we had remember seeing the film Searching for Sugar Man. And there was this wonderful animation in the film. And a light went off in my head, and the editor said, Deva, and the producer, Ben. And we reached out to these animators in Europe and had them come up with animation to represent those guys on the journey. So again, it was another way to tell the story. Always trying to figure out, as a filmmaker, as a documentary filmmaker, how to tell the story. And the one thing I want to say about documentary films is I believe as a documentary filmmaker, I'm not here to be didactic and to preach. I'm here to tell a story, to give you different perspectives, so as a viewer, you come away having your own opinions.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely right that story, rather than information, story is the core of our sort of craft. But like nowhere, I spent a decade as a war reporter, shooting, you know, short docs in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And nowhere were the sort of politics of storytelling more clear or more starkly on display than in war reporting. So, you know, there's the way that most of us see, the way that we see the war really almost entirely told to us is we see war filmed from the noses of bombs and narrated by former generals on like cable news, right? I mean, we never are allowed to see the populations that are living the wars, like, you know, see the war through their eyes, right? The camera never goes on the ground on that side. So I, you know, spent a long time working as an unembedded cameraman in Iraq and Afghanistan, trying to film stories that were from the perspective of the people who actually lived the war. So that, I mean, it felt like great, fulfilling work, but honestly, no one saw those films in America. And so what the sort of solution to that was to, or a solution, one way to try to thread that needle was we took an American correspondent, Jeremy Scahill, a war reporter, and used him as a kind of, as a storyteller who navigated through, you know, a war that spanned multiple continents and introduced us. It was a vehicle through which we became, you know, privileged spectators who were given access to like people's lives through his story. And that was a necessary move to make relatable storylines and relatable characters that, you know, people actually could see in the U.S. So these, you know, the questions of who the story belongs to, right? Like who and what story people are ready and able to hear is one that you are always kind of trying to triangulate and figure out what is the point of access of maximum impact that you can find. Because, you know, it can happen that, you know, the most compromised and least revealing story, like that is the story, you know, riding in with the tanks as they take Baghdad, right? That lots of people see that, but it tells you nothing about the truths of war. The least compromised, like the most pure in a way film that is completely from the perspective of Iraqis and is all in Arabic and has no relatable character, I mean, that also could make no impact because no one would hear it. And so, anyway, these are the things you are forced to navigate.
Let me ask you this question, Rick. I mean, as a filmmaker, do you feel like you have a responsibility? On the other side of the camera, should the Iraqis be telling their own story? Should black filmmakers be telling the stories of black people? I mean, do you feel that you're being intrusive by telling this story of these people?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. That issue, the issue of representation and who should tell which stories is, I mean, of course, there need to be Iraqi filmmakers telling the stories of Iraqis. And especially now where our country is dealing with a reckoning around race that we haven't, I mean, that in my short life, I haven't seen. I mean, we're at a moment of incredible danger and possibility where this sort of blood knot of race that has been at the center of American culture since the beginning is, you know, is whatever. We're confronting it, I guess, at least in some way. But absolutely, there are stories that are not mine to tell, right? In Afghanistan and Iraq, I was constantly kind of overwhelmed and humbled by the kind come to the trust and the invitation that people made. I mean, people desperately wanted to tell their stories and have their stories be heard. I mean, we would show up at houses where the last Americans they'd seen had knocked their door in and killed half their family, and they would invite us in and sit us down and want to relive the most terrible moments in their life with us because they believed that it could make a difference, right? And so I feel like and felt charged with this responsibility to do everything I could to bring those voices to an audience that could hear them.
I'm going to disagree a little bit on the representation issue. I don't think there are things, I don't think there are stories that are not my stories to tell. I can tell anybody's story if I'm professional enough and talented enough. I spent 41 years in the newspaper business, and the overwhelming majority of the stories that I ever worked on, same thing at NBC, were not stories about African Americans. I wrote stories about black people when I was in the news business. So when the issues were news, then I pounced and told the stories wholeheartedly and passionately. But I would do the same thing with anybody's story. My wife is Jewish, and her parents, many of their friends, are Holocaust survivors. If I saw a couple or a family who had a remarkable story to tell about the Holocaust or the aftermath of the Holocaust or the impact of the Holocaust, I would have no qualms about writing a story or doing a documentary about that family and its experiences. And I think that you go down a dangerous road when you start deciding ethnically who can tell, or religiously or any other kind of way, who can tell whose story. It's a question of who's got the experience, the talent, the passion, the technique to properly and effectively tell these stories.
This business of people, Sam started out, he was talking about characters and people and finding the story and how important it is to have good characters. My observation in one of my films called Paper Tigers was I spent a year in Walla Walla, Washington, following high school seniors in an alternative school for kids that had really been through the mill and were being sort of educated in a novel, sort of trauma-informed approach. And, when I got there and I settled in, for 3 or 4 months I was hitting my head against the wall because I just could not get these kids to engage. And the teachers would tell me, oh, you got to talk to Steven. Steven's going to, you just can't believe this kid. And then, every time he saw me in the hallway, he'd run the other direction because I think someone had tipped him off that someone had spoken highly of him. And this was a dynamic that went on for 3 or 4 months, and the project was going downhill fast. And then I just thought, well, maybe I can work collaboratively with the kids and let them take some ownership over their own story. So I handed out to 6 of the kids HD cams and, had an agreement with them that they were under no obligation to discuss anything that they didn't want to discuss. They wanted to film their skateboards and themselves playing in their vans. That's fine. If you want to say something, that's fine, whatever. Just give me the cameras back at the end of the year. and that really, if I hadn't have brought them into the process, I think it never would have happened. And I feel like, and then I've been in this situation before, this idea of, whose story you're telling. And in this case, I felt like it empowered them and made them feel, because these are borderline, some of them weren't even 18 yet. So I was very sensitive about, by the way, I did a documentary a number of years ago, and my son was one of the characters. It's a film about dyslexia, and he had a really strong and powerful point of view that was captured in a film called The Big Picture. And 4 years later, we were having an interesting discussion where he said, I don't really, there's like half of the stuff I said, I no longer feel, and I've evolved on, and I'm like frozen in time. And it's a little bit annoying to be frozen in time, and I've evolved in other places, and you know, so having gone through that with my own son, with these kids, I felt particularly sensitive about trying to not box them in from my point of view as much as possible. But in the end, you're still editing, you know. I mean, in the end, you're still controlling the game. But, you know, I showed them the rough cut before it was final to make sure that everything was cool. And, you know, I gave more latitude to them than I have with other characters, where I really wanted to give them a chance to raise concerns. One of the young ladies, you know, came forth and said, if you include me, what I said in that moment, my boyfriend's going to beat me up. And so I was like, well, let's take it out. So, you know, but I feel like I'm always striving to figure out how to get more character, because a lot of my films can potentially get dry, because I'm trying to educate and drive information that can be potentially dry, and that's the essential challenge for me. How do you take important stuff that's boring as shit and somehow make it entertaining? That's my essential challenge.
No, that is a challenge. And then also when you're grounding films in individuals, characters, stories, how do you then make it feel more universal and about the bigger issues? How do you then draw back and do some sort of editorializing, even if it isn't overt? Because at the end of the day, your film does have a message and that goes beyond the individual. So and when you don't have narration, it's harder. When you do have narration, then you have to struggle with the tone of that narration and getting it just right. There's music, there's lots of different tools. I mean, what have you experienced in that?
I mean, I'm working on a film now about the police killing of Laquan McDonald in Chicago, and there's and the cover up around that, and there's a trial that hasn't started yet but is about to start. And you know, it's one of these, it's one of the far too many cases of a young 17-year-old black kid in Chicago who was murdered by the police. And there is a video of it that it shows with absolute clarity what happened. So there's like really no question about what happened. But and it's a case about which we know more than is known about any other police killing and cover-up in history, because of the because of the incredible investigative journalism that has been done, because of the tens of thousands of pages of internal communications between like the police and the state's attorney that exist, because of the whistleblowers who've come forward and other, you know, prime characters who've come forward. But in spite of the fact that we know all these things, all of these facts are not enough to secure the narrative, right? There are still police officers, the Fraternal Order of Police, who say that this wasn't murder. And there is still a chance that a jury will agree with them in spite of all these things. And you know, it's one of the police officers actually said to us, "This reminds me of Rodney King, and what the country needs to do is not rush to judgment, but look at what happens in court." So for him, the message of Rodney King is, oh, these were police officers who were wrongly accused by the public, and then, you know, were exonerated in court. Not what that story means to like everyone else in the world, right? That this is a massive miscarriage of judgment, of justice by like the system. That there is, so there are narratives, there are stories that are pieced together with exactly the same facts that are completely, you know, represent truths that are diametrically opposed to each other. And that is it's a fascinating kind of like insane process that we have to deal with. But to a lesser degree, to a less sort of stark degree, the same is true in any film. I mean, you are marshaling a set of facts and, you know, turning it into those facts don't determine the narrative. The narrative is something that you have to create and sort of fight for.
I would say, to go back to what you were asking about, how do you give this film a sense of universality? Mm-hmm. To me, the big challenge is to always, with any documentary I'm involved with, to find people that can speak to their experience in a way that anybody in the audience, black, white, Asian, can identify with. Mm-hmm. That, to me, is the big challenge. Mm-hmm. If you can find those people and hope they can tell those stories where the audience can connect with them on an emotional level, that to me is a success. The hardest type of documentary is what you're saying, Jamie, is when you have someone, you're trying to do a documentary about a particular, like I'm working on a documentary now about voter suppression and voter fraud. Man, is this hard. Talk about trying to make something sexy. It's tough, you know, so we're challenged with telling stories of people in different communities who are dealing with voter suppression and voter fraud. At the same time as we're trying to bring in so-called historians to give us the information, but the big challenge is to find historians that seem human and not robotic, you know. So it's a big challenge, you know, and it's one of those things that you keep grappling with. Because I did this on another film about gerrymandering, that was also that I edited. That was hard, you know. So that's a real challenge. It's really really hard to make those things sexy.
Yeah. No, and so let's talk about narration, because sometimes I think when you're not using narration, you think, oh, it would be so easy if we could just use some narration. But Bob, in your film, do you use narration? And I know, Jamie, you do. And it has its own challenges, right?
I did narration, and I thought in this film it had to have narration because we went through a lot of different eras. We went back to actually the early part of the 20th century, and we talked about the Great Migration to the north in the early part of the century and mid-century, and we talked about the impact of the Great Recession. And you know, I could not figure out a way to do all of that without narration. What really threw me was the folks that I was working with. It was always I wrote the script, so it was always understood that there was going to be narration. I didn't know that I was going to narrate the film. They said, "Well, Bob, you know, you're the one who knows this story the best, and you've written it, and you've done TV, so you know, why wouldn't you narrate it?" I had a million reasons why, but I ended up narrating it. But I don't know that that's my favorite kind of documentary. I love the films where the story seems to tell itself right before your very eyes. And I would love to have the challenge of telling a story where the folks themselves just tell the story, but you know, essentially without my help other than editing. And you mentioned about how do you make stories universal. And throughout my print career, one of the things I did well as a reporter was interview people. And over decades, you meet so many interesting people. And by that, I don't mean the famous people or the office holders or stuff, but the people involved in all kinds of situations, many of them terrible situations. And sometimes I'd be there with a notebook, and I would just say, geez, if only there was a person here with a camera who could just capture this person talking, because it's just so amazing or powerful or effective or emotional. And I think that there is a tendency, certainly in the news business, I don't know about documentary filmmakers, but I think that there is a tendency to believe that something has to appear terrific at first before you actually go after these folks and use them, when in fact, very often, an individual or a family may not seem like anything spectacular, but as you began to talk to them and began to see them interact, you suddenly find out that there's something wonderful and universal here. And I think the universality comes from the fact that these are human beings who have a story to tell, and other human beings will see it and respond to it.
You know, but the big challenge with documentaries is that a lot of us, you know, when we put these things together for the HBOs and the Showtimes, the first response is, well, what's the story?
Yeah.
You know, set it up, set it up, set it up. So it becomes a challenge. I mean, I was saying to someone a few weeks ago that Frederick Wiseman's new film came out about the public library. And I grew up watching Frederick Wiseman's films, but the challenge for most audiences today is to be able to sit through his films because there's no narration. And he does what you're saying, Bob. He slowly builds and builds and builds, but you got to wait 3 hours.
Yeah, I didn't really mean wait on camera. I meant that's one of the ways you can find the people who have a compelling story to tell.
I see.
But that whole interview does not have to unfold. Because I'm not watching it either.
No, and I think it's it's a tension, right? Because you do need to find a story, because if not, then those words are not going to add up to more than the sum of their parts, perhaps, and might be wasted. You can't just assemble a random sampling of people, right?
I mean, I think I'm sorry. I think one of the big problems is how much this stuff costs if you're doing the kind of films that we're talking about here. I mean, somebody has to foot the bill. I was lucky in the sense that I was a trustee of a foundation that Bill Moyers is the president of, and we got to talking about the issue, and Bill asked if I wanted to make a film about it. And he said that if I did, that the foundation would finance the film and be no strings attached. I mean, I could just do the film however I wanted to do it. Well, who has that opportunity? That's a gift from the gods, and that almost never happens. So I think some of the most important stories that need to be told aren't told, because to do them properly would cost an immense amount of money. I'll give you a quick example, or a couple of quick examples. Most Americans, we know what the situation is like in the country right now. I mean, it's chaotic and for a lot of people horrifying. But how did we get here? How did the United States get to the situation that it's in now? Well, you could do a documentary, any number of approaches to that, but you could do a profound film on that. For example, you could follow the Republican Party over the past 40 years, and you could tell that story in a heck of a good way, but it would cost an awful lot of money to do that properly, and to do all the travel, and to hire all the people that you needed to do, and pay for the archival footage and all that other kind of stuff. And one other example is global warming. We need another film post Al Gore. I mean, we look at what we were going through just this year. If you had like a lot of minds working maybe on a lot of films, but the story of climate change needs to be told in a compelling way that actually reaches the masses to the point where we understand what is actually happening to us. But it would cost a mint, and I don't know how you would finance that sort of an effort.
Well, I think one of the great things about documentaries is, if you have the budget, is the luxury of time, right? The luxury of time to find your story, to let your story unfold, if that's the case, the luxury of time in the edit room. But yeah, time is money, so that is definitely an issue. I mean,
I interrupted you, so.
Yeah, were you going to speak about narration? Back to narration?
Narration. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, I was interested in looking at, why do we know so little about something that can really make a big difference with climate change, and that's renewable energy, and that it's exploding and scaling up rapidly. It's a technological revolution like the previous ones. And, but it's really complicated, and it's very geeky and boring, and trying to deal with it as a topic from a filmmaking point of view. And I remember, it's kind of strange, I was snorkeling, and I was thinking to myself, I heard my own voice saying, you know what, how can I tell this story? I mean, I'm such a jackass. I just, I drive my car the wrong way, I leave my lights on, I do all this stuff. And as I was exploring my own hypocrisy on the topic, I realized, well, that's actually maybe more interesting than anything. It's like, what does this really mean to me? And I never dreamed that I would actually be in my own documentary, and certainly.
And you as a stand-in for most average Americans, yeah.
And I think, just representing exactly so many questions that all of us have. And I wasn't in a position, Sam said, I wasn't in a position to lecture or dictate, because I felt like, I wasn't a Puritan and I wasn't a know-it-all, but I really felt like the story had some importance. So, I threw in the narration more as to sort of give access to the personal exploration, as opposed to more traditionally needing it to bridge gaps in history or other kind of gaps. Mm-hmm. But it was really hard, and I never thought, I've always felt like it wasn't necessarily my cup of tea in general with my films, so it was the first time I'd done it, but I don't really think there was any other way to do it on this particular project.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about how you construct a documentary and how you reach these goals. What's been some of your experiences with, you've made the film, you're happy with it, and then it goes out into the world, and, is it reacted to in the way you expected, in the way you wanted, in some unexpected ways? What's been your experience with the reception on the
Well, the most complicated one was I made a film in 2009, right after Obama's election, about the rise of white supremacist groups in the immediate aftermath of his victory, and we infiltrated skinhead groups in middle of nowhere in Arizona and filmed with the National Socialist Movement with their swastikas and whatever, back in 2009. And we made this film that was, showing how this sort of group, it had its own dangers in itself, but also even more dangerous than that was giving voice and articulating this subtext, articulating this subterranean kind of narrative that was, giving energy to the Tea Party and to the whole kind of right wing of the Republican Party at the time. Anyway, we made this film, which I was proud of and thought was great. And when it was released, there was good reception. But then on Stormfront, the neo-Nazi website, they started posting about it, and they thought it was great.
Oh my God.
They thought thank God, they've connected the Republicans to us and the Tea Party to us. And so, yeah, sure, 90% of the people who watch this film are going to think that we're appalling and they're going to be outraged by us, but they're not, that 90% is never going to be with us. The 10% that don't, we're recruiting them through this work. And that's a terrifying thing.
I always find that after you finish a film, to me, you need to have time to sort of process what you think of that film. And it doesn't happen in 2 months after you finish. It doesn't happen in 6 months. It happens in 2 or 3 years. You watch it again. And I may be sort of like a glutton, but I like to read every article or review about a film I do, even if they slam it. Because sometimes when they slam the film or they don't like the film, it opens up something about something I said, I didn't think of it that way. It gives me a different perspective, And I believe that that your film should be heavily criticized. I always believe that. I believe that. And that. And that, I don't want everybody to look at my film and say, it was just wonderful. I loved it. It was great. To me, that's not educational for me. I'm not learning anything.
Yeah.
I learn when people say things about the film and have something that's negative that makes me think,
So what was an example of that?
I'll give you a great example. I edited this film in 2012 about Venus and Serena. That was on Showtime. And we took it out to this film festival in Seattle. And there was a review that this little critic wrote. I cut that review and saved it. And he said, whoever put this film together, all these elements did not mean any direction. It seemed like it was a mess. And I thought, that's a really interesting review. And I told my son, and my son Jason said, Dad, you like a review like that? I said, yeah, man, it's all right.
Interesting. That's good.
To me, it's fine.
Open-minded.
I'm an adult. I can handle that.
Critics are subjective, audiences.
You got to be subjective. That's what film's about. That's what art's about.
Did you think he was right?
No. I didn't think he was right. But I appreciate his point of view. And I think that's fine. Because if, for me, I always say part of the making of a documentary is the process. I love the process. And sometimes when I finish the film, I'm a little disappointed because I say, well, a documentary, as we all know, can be many different things. But at a certain point, as the filmmaker, as a director, you have to find the point of view that you think works for this film.
You have to finish the film.
And you have to finish it.
Point.
You have to finish it. It doesn't mean that that's the end all and be all, and that's the only way that film could have been put together. That's what's so wonderful about making documentaries and you don't have scripts. It's because you're forced to challenge yourself to say, what is my narrative? What's my through line to tell this story? You know,
And it changes.
and it changes all the time. You know.
See, Sam is a healthy guy.
Strong ego.
For me, whenever I'm working on anything, it's the work that's important. I throw everything into it, and when it's done, it's done. Now, this is easy, I guess, if you're a columnist, which I was for 25 years. So I write a column, and at the end of the column, it was done. And you know how they have now in the digital age, they have comments underneath or on column. At the Times, actually, they didn't have it right under the column, which was good. You had to like click something, but the comments were there. I never looked at a comment in my life. I do not want to know what anybody has to say about this column. I'm thinking about whatever the next column is. So after I left the Times, I wrote a book. And you know, if you're used to 750 words at a pop, writing a book is a heavy lift. So I write this book, and I'm just so happy when that project is finally done. But they tell you, you got to go on a book tour, and you got to sell this book, and you got to do interviews, and there are going to be reviews in the paper. I actually got a review in the New York Times. I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Thank God they gave me a good review. But I hated all of that. I don't want to go on a book tour. I don't want to talk about the book. I don't want to hear what you think about the book. I want none of that. And so it's the same thing with the film. So I don't want to go to film festivals. I mean, I love Woodstock, and I've had like a really great time here, surprisingly, because I didn't want to come. We've been to... But I would prefer to be home in front of the computer working on the next project. So it's kind of sort of a different take.
So I'm far more fond of getting feedback when I'm still working. I love to get feedback in process. I do countless screenings, test screenings. I assemble, right from rough cut on down, rough assemblage on down even sometimes, over and over again. And I select a core group of mean friends that are are smart and have my best interest, but are also kind of mean and so, and I just rotate these little groups through various screenings as I'm coming down through the process, and it's painful. I mean, the lights go up, and you're like, you can feel it when things aren't working. It's awkward and painful, and then you just go home and cry, and then go back to work the next day. And that whole thing is like, it's great. And you just do that and do that and do that. For me, once I'm done, I'm sort of in Bob's camp. It's like, I just had too many times, particularly these days, with the proliferation of, anybody can hang a shingle these days, and I just find that my energies are better spent either A, getting to work on the next project, because I've always felt like having a wheel continually turning so that I'm never not moving forward on a story. I'm always just turning the wheel, that I just get on that just keep that wheel turning and keep moving forward. And that usually works out best. And I think the other thing too is I think one of the things about making films, if you're interested, as I am, in looking at vexing health problems or environmental problems and dealing with those in your work, is that this afterlife for the film, in terms of trying to work with allies and communities on creating change, so that your work is not just a matter of are people going to watch it or not, but how can you work within communities to facilitate meaningful impact and change. And that's a big part of it if that's what you do. And for me, it's a really important part. It's personally really satisfying to me. I'm as much interested in, when I show up in Cincinnati on Thursday night and and I'm there at a gala event with the Cincinnati Youth Collaborative, and the executive director comes over to me and goes, "You have no idea how much your film was, we couldn't have done X, Y, and Z." That's the best review I could ever get. That for me. So, it's protective in a way because you just continue to, connect your motivations and your heart to the impact. And I just stay on that because when I'm done with a film, I can't fix anything. But I definitely agree with Sam in that a couple of years later, I can look back and see all the mistakes I've made or things that I wish I'd thought of to do differently. But that never emerges for a while. It's just like you just don't have access to it. I mean, if you did, you'd never finish.
Yeah. But all of you must have experienced that thing where audiences, either at a film festival, some sort of screening, or even when it's distributed and you get sort of emails and letters or whatever from people who've seen it and who say, this film changed my life. I mean, that does happen.
I mean, there's nothing like screening a film in a theater packed with people that you've made. There's absolutely nothing like that experience at all. I mean, I was 19 when I went and made my first film, and I knew absolutely nothing. I didn't know how to shoot. I spent 2.5 years in Chiapas filming with the Zapatistas, in '95, and we made this film that we thought was amazing. We filmed Subcomandante Marcos and this army of Mayan peasants who had fought for and won a piece of autonomous territory in southern Mexico that is still autonomous. Anyway, it was an amazing film. We thought it was great. We thought, of course, it's going to be picked up. It'll be in theaters all over the world in no time. But no one had. We wasted a year trying to get people to buy it. So we loaded up a minivan with VHS tapes. We printed 20,000 VHS tapes, and we drove around the country from from college town to college town. And we had a video projector, and we screened this film on every wall we could. And I really thought this was the only film I would ever make. I was in Central America when the Zapatista uprising happened, and I felt like I was living in Mexico and felt like a part of it, and I felt like this was a role I could have to help, protect this movement that was important to me. So I thought it was the only thing I was ever going to do. But touring around and showing it, in a parking lot in Austin, Texas, to 400 people in lawn chairs, and then, at the end of the tour, realizing that we'd sold 20,000 VHS tapes, and that 20,000 people had funded our film, $20 at a time. That was completely unreal. And having the lights come up at the end and knowing that everyone there had been on this journey with you and was ready to talk and to move and to, respond to what they felt I knew after that was the only thing I ever wanted to do.
Nice.
Yeah.
And what about this issue of how do you get your film to the unintended audience? How do you get your film to not preaching to the converted, but to the people who might be opposed to hearing the message? And does that figure into your editorial process at all?
For me, it depends on the film. I just finished co-directing a film about ACORN, organization that got defunded by Congress in 2009, pulled down by the right wing. And as me and my co-director, Ruben Atlas, were putting the film together, we felt, again, the word responsibility. We felt the responsibility not to make a film that was just going to be pro ACORN, but wanted to sort of make sure we heard voices from the right and had them articulate their issues with ACORN. So we really, really strategized to make sure that we talked to Stephen King. We talked to people who had strong issues with ACORN. We looked inside the organization at the internal issues that also led to this organization becoming, fractured, So we felt as documentary filmmakers, we wanted to look at it from a really holistic perspective, And we felt if we had made the one-sided film, it wouldn't work. And I showed that film in upstate New York about 4 months ago, and to a young audience of aspiring documentary filmmakers and some people who came from the outside. And this one young lady at the end of the film, during the Q&A, she said, "This film, my father, who's basically a Trump Republican," she said, "my father would like this film."
Interesting.
Yeah. My father would like this film.
Compliment.
And that's exactly what we're hoping for.
Yeah.
To get different perspectives on the film, to see it and to have their own point of view be able to see their point of view
Reflected, yeah.
reflected.
Anybody else?
When I'm working on something, I don't think of the audience. I write for a mass audience, or the film was for a mass audience, not for a particular segment of the audience. I would hope that if conservatives, for example, if conservatives saw my film, since it was honestly made, I would hope that the film would have an impact, that they would look and say, well, this is a clear injustice, or these are clear injustices that are being shown here. It's not, in my view, it shouldn't be seen as a left or right issue. And I did the same thing with columns, or when I was doing pieces for NBC, although I understand Sam's point, and especially if you're talking about something like Acorn, was a highly politically charged, I think completely fouled up situation. But I can understand why you would have to be very careful when you're making that documentary. I have not had to do that. Can I just tell a quick thing about, you talked about people who say something changed their life. When I left the Times, I wrote a column, and at the end I said that after 18 years I was leaving the paper and stuff, and I left an email address and saying, you can contact me at this. I had no idea. I mean, there were like, thousands upon thousands of emails came in. So that was an email that I was personally going to use. So I couldn't use it, and I didn't have a prepared answer for all these folks. But I started reading these emails, and a lot of them were really emotional. But one stood out. This one guy said, loved your work, loved your columns. My wife and I had a ritual where at breakfast every morning, every time that your column was in the paper, one of us would read it out loud to the other, and and vice versa. And then he said, my wife passed away several months ago, and every time I read your column, I feel like I'm hearing her voice. And I was like, whoa, I showed that to my wife. I was not able to answer all of those emails, but I made sure that I answered that one. Yeah.
Connection, so strong. All right, we're going to go to questions soon, but I just wanted to say, in this world we're living, in this crazy world we're living in now, with so many issues being so urgent, how do you think about deciding, what you're going to do next?
I've been running for the hills. I think that
A travel documentary about New Zealand.
all right, I'm watching a lot of sports. I'm trying not to watch CNN and NBC, and I'm reading fiction. So
There you go.
I don't know what the next project will be, but I do think that the situation is as serious as any time in my lifetime. And if there was one project, I don't know what medium, but if there's one project that needs to be done, it's that it has to be gotten across to the American people, all those who are dissatisfied with what's going on, the importance of voting, because too many people who have what I think of are correct or sound political views do not vote. And so Obama was elected in 2008, but then the Democratic vote fell off a cliff in 2010, and the Republicans took control of the House, and the same thing happened 4 years later, and the Republicans took control of the Senate. If in 2018, next year, the Democrats could get control of just one House of Congress, it would make such a difference. So if it's the House of Representatives, the first thing is it would be able to stop legislation. So, they wouldn't be able to get these crazy bills passed. Two, you would have all those committee chairmanships in Democratic hands, and they could conduct investigations, and they would have subpoena powers. It would make all the difference in the world. But it's an off-year election. So I think everything that moves should be signed up to vote. every time people gather, like at a gathering like this, people should stress the importance of voting on college campuses. You know, I just think that that message has to be gotten across.
Yeah, you know, an interesting thing about this. I was just talking with a guy, some of you may have heard of him, his name's Nathaniel Stinnett, and he started an organization called environmentalvoter.org. And what he's found is that, you know, if you look at people who do vote, environmental issues are not high up on that list of concerns. But, you know, then he looked at, well, who's voting? And it turns out that it's very few people, as we all know, but guess what? Environmentalists don't really vote. I mean, it's staggering to believe, right? Isn't that shocking?
Yes.
But it's true. And they do a lot of good things and worry about a lot of things and try to fix a lot of things, but apparently they don't show up on election day. So in his mind, rather than trying to change people's minds and shift people on issues, he's like, well, I'd rather fix habits than change minds, and these are habits that need to be instilled. So he has a program, and his goal is to raise the sort of, you know, the NRA equivalent of heavy-duty environmental voters to step in and get involved. So he has a 6-state campaign that he's going to be running to really try and drive those voters. It's completely untapped territory that could really make a difference. And we're going to do everything I can with my renewable energy film to participate in that, because, you know, as you say, it's really up to us.
It really is.
I can't hear what she's saying.
She doesn't think we have the leaders on the left that we need. Could I just respond to that? That may or may not be true, but for the sake of this discussion, I'll say it is true. But this past election was an emergency election. Donald Trump was on the ballot. I was not a great big fan of Hillary Clinton. But look what has happened to this country because Donald Trump got elected president. So even if you don't think there's great leadership on the other side, and that probably is true, it's really important to vote to prevent someone like Donald Trump from coming in and leading the nation into a catastrophe.
So Sam, you're doing a film on voter suppression, right? Okay, well, we can go to questions soon, but you're doing a film on voter suppression, right? Next is your next project?
Yeah,
or one of your next projects?
one of the films is voter suppression and voter fraud, and we're trying to galvanize the public, you know, to look at these issues and to see it from the perspective of why is there voter suppression and what the people on the right are trying to do to change the dynamics of who votes and why and why people don't vote, you know, and you know, it's been a fascinating process to sort of listen to both sides. I went out to Kansas City and interviewed Chris Kobach, who's on the Pence Commission, and his rationalization, you know, if I wasn't such a smart person, I mean, intelligent enough, I would buy into what he was saying, you know, in terms of, you know, the immigrants are people who are not from this country are voting illegally, busloads of people coming in to vote, you know. I mean, they create such myths. You know, they create such myths. And the problem with Americans is that Americans don't listen to anything besides the first sentence. You know, they don't do any deep dive. There's no research. There's no thinking. I mean, if Trump says 3 to 5 million people vote illegally, that's why they win the popular vote, you got people in America who believe him. It's outrageous. You know, and and we show in this film there's no physical proof that happens. You know,
Right.
So you're right, Bob. This is scary, scary times. Scary times.
And Richard, are you doing something on?
It has to do with like your audience. You know, my sense about documentaries is that who goes to see documentaries? Who's going to go? And how do you, I mean, this is what you've been talking about. How do you reach like the general public? And now the general public isn't interested in that much news. There's a whole lot of negativity about where we are. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff around how are you going to get these great messages and information across?
Well, I always say to people, my documentaries, I will go anywhere to show them. community centers, churches, the Republican convention. I'll show it anywhere. You have to be very proactive. You have to be like Michael Moore in a way. You have to be very proactive to get these films out there. You can't just sit back and say, okay, you know, HBO will show my film 6 times, I'll be satisfied. PBS will show
More
my
than 6 times. Perpetually ongoing.
You know, you got to be proactive as a filmmaker. You know, what Jamie's saying, you have to be proactive. And the thing that's also fascinating, we're living in a time now, and everybody can attest to this, where documentaries are really front and center. You know,
Yeah, and
people,
flourishing.
They are really flourishing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's, you know, I've been to 3 festivals. I think I've seen 8 documentaries in the last week and a half. You know,
That's a small fraction of what's out there.
I know, but 8 just in 2 weeks.
You know, when we were making my recent film, I mean, we started right from the start in my own research process. We started thinking about who our allies were going to be in terms of reaching new audiences and how to do that. And that process is concomitant with the making of the film. And those are relationships. It's not just an email address or, you know, a title of a nonprofit. You get to know, first of all, to really get a deeper understanding on the issue. But secondly, when the time comes and the movie's finally done, you've been working together along the way, and you know that investment in these relationships, particularly with organizations that view what it is you're saying in your film as really helpful to what they're doing. And you know you have to create a firewall editorially, of course, but you know that relationship. I mean, the sooner you get going on those relationships, you know, and those organizations, large organizations, have a way of opening doors into communities that you could never do individually as a filmmaker. So, you know, you've got to, this is the world we live in. I mean, I know so many authors who, you know, have written through this transition in which it used to be you finish your book and you were done, and it was another person's job to market and sell and distribute that book. Well, the same thing with film. The great thing is, of course, there's so many more opportunities in terms of, you know, the expense of production, many more platforms, way to self-distribute and all that. But, you know, it takes hard work. And if you're not up for it, good luck. You know, you got to be up for it.
Okay, should we go to general questions? It's hard for us to see.
I have
There's
a
one.
question about what you say on that, you know.
Thank you.
Living here, you know, I'm well aware there are a lot of hunters. I have a lot of friends who are hunters, fishermen. They might be Republicans. It doesn't mean they voted for Trump, but they're great environmentalists. And a lot of them belong to organizations. And I'm sure you know out west with the issue with the wolves and all that. I mean, Sierra Club's trying to do that. You know, they're trying to mobilize. You're never going to get to the people who are, you know, glued to Fox sound bites. You know, it's a lost cause. They're not doing any deep diving, like you say. But there are organizations that can help bridge that gap somehow and educate people who to go a little deeper and wider. And I'm a nurse. I talk to a lot of people on all sides of the spectrum. And I know when Bush was running, those people were doing that. You know, they were recoiling from him the second time because of his issues and being born with a silver spoon in his mouth. It became clear, but it took time and there was a lot of damage done. I'm just saying, you know, there are organizations I would think that you can infiltrate with your films. And
Well, you know, I think what Sam was talking about, you know, you pick and choose and find what is the best story for you. You go into an area, you go into something like clean energy, and there's 1,000 stories to tell, and it's overwhelming. But as I looked at it in this case, you know, what I saw unexpectedly was that there was movement, you know, in the middle, and there were a number of cases where what we perceived to be on the right or conservative were actually in the game. And that to me, you know, and you're looking at like, well, what's the valuable story to tell here? You know, and sometimes it is good to just rally the core. Maybe sometimes the core needs to be, you know, fired up. And maybe that's what you want to do. for me, the stubborn divisiveness that we have right now and the polarized cultures that we have right now, I thought, wow, that would be really subversive to just go in there and show the story of how many conservatives are getting behind clean energy. Because then you have a chance to have a different kind of dialogue on something that's traditionally been completely polarized. I mean, most people that are outside the active environmentalist community do not feel welcome. And that's the environmental community's issue. And it's also just, again, it's a stubborn myth. And you look at where the money's being spent and who's making things happen. It's a lot more in the middle than people realize. So those are opportunities.
Okay, let's go to another question.
The upside of the polarization.
Okay,
now.
right back there.
Yeah.
Yeah, right there, yeah.
Okay, this touches on some of the things we've been talking about. You know, a lot has been said about confirmation bias and that people see things through the lens of what they already believe. And I know several of you have touched on that in terms of how people look at your films. And also people have talked about preaching to the choir, you know, reaching only people who already are on board. How do you feel you can really change people's views and speak to them emotionally, since often intellectually doesn't always work? So what have you found that reaches people and really does get them to look at things differently?
Yeah, I think that that is actually why film is so important, because it is not. I mean, I remember in the early '90s, people talked about there being an information war, like there's a war of facts, you know, and you have to counter their facts with the right facts or whatever. And that, I think, is clearly not the case. There's a war of stories. There's a clash of the kind of the myths and the mythopoetic structures that undergird the way that you process information. And if you're holding on to one of these sort of powerful stories about your identity and your place and you being under threat, I mean, that's not going to be dislodged with facts. That's going to be dislodged with a more powerful story that can defeat it. And that's what that's what film at its best can engage with people at the level of stories and myths. But it's a massive challenge. But see, I see this moment as an incredibly dangerous moment, but one that's also filled with possibilities and potentials that we haven't seen in like a long time. I think that the political status quo has been cracked open. I mean, we have now inequality that has reached the same levels it was at the Gilded Age, right before the Great Depression. We have populist movements on the left and the right that are emerging. We have the most polarized elections that I've ever seen. I made a piece for Frontline and PBS about the rise of like the militia movement out west, filming with the Bundys and with a bunch of the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers, these like new sort of or old or reformed groups. And I expected them to be like the militia movements of the early '90s, right? Like the Ruby Ridge, Waco groups, which were at their core built around Christian identity. They were racists. It was the Aryan Nation and Christian identity groups, and race was their sort of central. But there were big chunks of this populist kind of movement that were that could have been allies of progressive forces, right? That saw an economic order that had left them behind. Were stuck in a place where they felt written out of the economic and cultural future of the country, right? And were not about sort of white supremacy and the whatever. Were concerned with the sort of economic devastation and underdevelopment and opioid crisis that was like gutting their kind of communities. Anyway, so I think that there is that we can't write off entire swaths of the population as unredeemable. I mean that everyone can be redeemed.
In back there.
This is a question. Is your name Sam?
Yeah.
Right. Sam, this is a question I have for you that basically is kind of playing a game, yes or no. And the first one is, Knowing the fact that the election was obviously run and Trump won, and claims the fact that he won the electoral vote but lost the popular vote, is there any time in history, yes or no, that this has happened?
Yeah. The Gore.
Fine. Second question, with the relationship between Putin and Trump, knowing the fact is that how much obviously Putin doesn't like the United States, and the ability of Russia to be able to hack things, do you think it's feasible to think that Russia had something to do with the winning the electoral vote with this capability?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Next question. Down in front. There's a microphone.
Hi. You are all so amazing, and one of the things that Bob had brought up was how do we collaborate? Just listening to the environmental films that you've made on voter suppression, all these things, and also what you brought up about how do we make documentaries entertaining. Those are all really, really important issues, and I just think that collaborating, if documentary filmmakers collaborated with each other to make their issues even stronger would be wonderful. I don't know that I have a question. I'm just...
Okay. Good comment.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks. In the red shirt.
Yeah, I guess my question is, besides Richard, is there anybody doing documentaries from the right? I mean, Richard, you've talked about how some of the people that you've had comments from, positive comments, are people from the right thinking that what you're saying is telling their story. And my sense is that the panel, and I think most people who make documentaries are coming from the left. And I'm just curious as to whether or not in your group of documentarians, if you will, whether you see a voice coming from the right.
I mean, there have been. Yeah. A number.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's a fact, that there's a whole network of films that are being funded by Russians that they...
Yeah. No, there definitely are.
Yeah, I mean, documentaries, we exist in a broader kind of media universe, right? Like our films drop into contexts that are already there. In most cases, sometimes you find a singular story that's not whatever, but and that context is made by the news that people are swimming in. Right. So, I mean, yeah, unfortunately, more people watch Fox News than have watched any of our films. I imagine at the end.
I've also, I've made plenty of films that just weren't politically oriented. I mean, there's a lot of, and some of my favorite, most entertaining it's a big, broad field. This is there should be more meaningful, I think, with the sort of integrity that's surrounding me on this panel, it would be really great to see some documentaries that were from a conservative point of view, with the same rigor, the same discipline. I'm not aware of that.
Back there, there's two questions. And then, yeah, getting close.
I think it was Sam who mentioned about a process. You always are disappointed when the movie is finished because the process is done. I just want each one of you to address, I don't know whether you all have the same kind of process you go through or different, what is that like, just from the movie making perspective?
I already told you mine. I mean, there's a film that I saw many years ago called The Bad and the Beautiful with Kirk Douglas. And he had a scene in the film where he said after the film was over, he was just depressed. Well, for me, I love the process. And usually when the film is done, I'll watch it, it's color corrected, it's mixed, and I'll say, oh, okay, it's done. You know, and I don't feel that exhilaration I felt through the process, the struggle. It's kind of an interesting thing for me that, to me, life is about struggle all the time, and I sort of savor that. I embrace that, and that's what makes me tick. So that's why the end of the process to me is the least exhilarating, for me.
I think it was Dorothy Parker who said, "I don't like writing, but I like having written," and I sort of have that feeling. I mean, whether you're in the middle of a column or in the middle of a book or in the middle of a film, I mean, and we started this off by talking about how hard it is making a documentary, and God knows that is the truth. I found that out very quickly. So it is a struggle, and it's like a heavy lift all the way through. But it is exhilarating. The work, I mean, we would really be lunatics if we did kind of the stuff that we do and you didn't enjoy any of it. But it is tough. And so when the project is finally done, I do have a feeling of exhilaration. It's like, you wipe your brow and you go, yes, a martini or a cocktail or something like that. I do enjoy completing it, yeah.
We're just in the opposite poles here.
Yeah. I don't have that, no.
There's another one back there and then one up here, and then we might be done.
My question to you is about intergenerational collaboration. Yesterday I went to see the high school films, and I was absolutely stunned by their subject matter. It was environmental, it was about depression, it was about politics. This younger generation has to confront what we're all struggling with. They're growing into it. Some of us saw differently. We saw something else before this moment, but they are growing into it, and there's a sense of thinking, involvement, and concern on their part for this is what they are inheriting. And I found that these high school kids, their voices were clear, and their voices were imaginative, and the way that they confronted these very difficult issues that we are also struggling with as adults was very poignant. So my question to you is, would you consider collaborating, interacting, or involving the younger generation where you really can be mentors?
Okay, good question. Let's hear from.
I'd like to take a shot at that. So Sally Roy, my colleague on this film, and I were at the American Documentary Film Festival in Palm Springs this summer. And my film was shown at a screening on a double bill with a young woman from California. And she was, I don't know, maybe she was in her early 30s, but she was pretty young, might have been late 20s. And so I'm watching this film, and it was so good. I thought that this film was so good. I was like, oh my God, like the kids are I'm struggling with this film, and the kids are making, these great films. So I was on a panel with her, and we got a chance to talk, and it was really great. I mean, she was like crackerjack smart. She was as smart as the film was good. And we've been in touch, but she's in California, so we haven't been in touch a lot. But she had said to me, I hadn't thought about it. She said, would you ever consider collaborating on a film? I had not considered it, but the short answer is yes. I think that it's really a long shot. But I think that you are exactly right, that there are young people all over this country who are smart, who are talented, who are working in film and other media, and very frankly, I think that the energy and the points of view and the talents of these younger people are really the hope of the United States, that we will get through this very difficult period that we're going through now. Yes.
Go ahead. Oh, no. Go ahead.
I mean, I think the filmmaking process is inherently incredibly collaborative and involves, a whole bunch of people. I mean, when I started out, it was like, you know, with 2 other people, we did everything ourselves. But like at this sort of level, I mean, you need to, the goal of any organizer is to replace yourself. And I think similarly, like we're working with, you know, you inevitably work on your projects with tons of young cinematographers, young, you know, associate producers who are super smart and you know, ambitious and rising up through the ranks. And it's my ambition that, you know, in 5 years they'll be doing everything I'm doing now and I can retire.
There's the work for them.
So, Happening, a Clean Energy Revolution was a product of the Redford Center, which is a nonprofit. So the film, we had to raise money philanthropically in order to make this film. Anything that happens with this film transactionally goes into the nonprofit. For me, it was a pro bono effort. And within the Redford Center, you know, we have a grant-making program that we do in conjunction with the New York Community Trust to support young filmmakers. And you know, what I see, my kids are in their early to mid-20s, and so I saw them grow up with a intuitive grasp of the language of film and image that I certainly didn't have growing up. And my life has been a transition from the literary world to the visual world, largely, and it's been very exciting to try and keep up. I love the challenge. But, you know, it's like the thing, if you learn to ski when you're 30 or 40 years old, you might get pretty good, but you're not going to be awesome. And I think there's some elements at play like that right now, and it's really exciting. And to not see that, I mean, I'd love to hear actually from Sam, who deals with kids all the time, if I could make any observation with what we do in helping, it's that the proficiency with the technology is off the charts. The ability to create provocative, beautiful, or ugly intent, you know, create a really compelling image is off the charts. Sometimes the story, the structure part of storytelling is not quite as advanced as those innate skills.
Yeah, you know, I'm a teacher. I teach at NYU, and I have done teaching at SVA, School of Visual Arts, and I always believe, going back to the beginning of the conversation, Nancy, responsibility. I feel this, and I still feel this for many years. I have responsibility to shepherd the aspiring documentary filmmakers, to support their work, to help them any way I can, as a teacher, as an executive producer, as a consultant. I do that, and I'll do that till they put me in the grave. I mean, I think it's important because the next generation of filmmakers, they have the tools. They have the tools, they know the technology better than we do. Again, it's about helping them become better storytellers.
Right.
And that's a responsibility that someone said I had to have when I was 30 years old, and I'm in my 60s now, and it's still a responsibility I cherish and believe in. Teaching, inspiring, and mentoring.
That's great. All right, we have one last question. 30 seconds, quick, and then we're done.
Thank you for the panel. It's been a great panel. I wonder if I could identify one big issue. It seems like there's a common theme about trying to get this message out to the main audience, both on the panel and in the audience. I'm wondering whether you consider the sophistication level, because it does seem on the right wing, the level of sophistication is very simple and the messages are very clear. They're not very interesting, but then on the, on the right wing, but on the left wing, you have very sophisticated documentaries and sophisticated messages, and you can almost see how those messages don't make it to the popular audience.
Anyone?
Well, I think that you made the point earlier about how important it is to tell the stories and create the myths and that sort of thing, which really resonate more powerfully than just presenting the facts to folks. The folks on the right, I think, have some inherent advantages in the sense that they don't care what they say. They don't care whether it's factual or based on fact or something like that. They don't care whether it's hateful or you know, whatever. So I think the folks on the left are constricted to some extent, but we have the power to be creative, and I think that we need to be more creative in telling our stories and creating our own myths and myths that are grounded in reality and factual data. And I think it's really important that we do that. I do think that we've fallen down in that area. And so, and not just in filmmaking, but in literature and in feature films and in plays and in journalism. It's really important that the folks who are liberals or who are on the left do that.
And I think there's a lack of a positive vision. Like, I mean, okay, so there's a story, we're going to bring coal back. We're going to return life to abandoned rural communities. We're going to go back to the days when men were men and the cows always made it to Abilene where they were paid out in gold, right? That's a fucking good story, right? Like, and what do we have? What does the left have to counter it with that? Like, we have excellent critique, an excellent way to critique sort of system. But I mean, no one is going to be saying we have the American dream. We have the possibility, we have diversity, we have a nation of immigrants. I mean, like that is not, there is a lack of kind of clarity and coherence to that story. Now, it's easier to tell a story if you don't care about the facts, right? It's easier to spin a good yarn if you're liberated from that. So it's not, I'm not saying it's like simple, but I think that's a serious problem, that we don't have a good fucking story.
Right.
Interesting. Interesting. All right, thanks to this incredible group of panelists. You were fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.